Welcome to the Remnant Trust at IPFW. The Remnant Trust is a private foundation located in Jeffersonville, Indiana. They own over 900 first and early edition significant historical works. We're lucky enough to have 53 of those works here on campus, along with 2 of our own from the IPFW Helmke Library. I'm Dr. Pat Ashton. I teach sociology and peace and conflict studies here at IPFW. I've studied these works, taught about them for many years, but I've also recently researched the particular stories behind these books. I'd like to share those with you. Let's take a look together at the Remnant Trust at IPFW. The next book in our development of the American character theme is Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave. He was enslaved in Maryland. The woman of the house of the first place he was a slave began to teach him to read. When the master found out, he sold Douglass to an extremely cruel master. And Douglass suffered horribly. He was regularly whipped for being independent and refusing tasks and so on. Douglass eventually escaped to the north, where he began giving speeches as part of the abolitionist movement and writing his autobiography, of which we have a first edition. Now, when his autobiography came out, many people said it could not possibly have been written by a former slave because it was so literate. Douglass was widely known by that time as an incredibly powerful speaker. In fact, I recommend you look up his speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. You can Google it, find out that it is an extremely powerful speech, every bit, in my opinion, as important as I Have a Dream and the Gettysburg Address. Douglass gave this speech in 1845 in Rochester, New York, and said, when he was asked to speak on the 4th of July, and he said, "I'm happy to be here to celebrate freedom. It's just too bad that my people aren't free. It's great that the Bill of Rights is a shining document. It's too bad it doesn't apply to us." It's a brilliant speech in which he makes his point without alienating people. Well, Douglass's friends were very concerned that because of the fugitive slave law, his former owners would come north, capture him, and re-enslave him. So they raised money and sent him to Great Britain to get him out of the country, to be safe. Douglass worked for 2 years in Great Britain, earned enough money to buy his freedom. He bought his freedom, he came back and started a newspaper called the North Star, which he published for 17 years. A vigorous defender of abolition, an opponent to slavery. It's appropriate that he sits here across from Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Later in Lincoln's life, in Lincoln's presidency, Douglass actually, he had moved to Washington, D.C., and he became friends with Abraham Lincoln. He was skeptical of Lincoln at first, but when Lincoln agreed to free the slaves, Douglass was extremely supportive. So, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. Next, appropriately, we have the Gettysburg Address. Although you'd be hard-pressed to know that Abraham Lincoln had anything to do with it if you look at the official program. And this is indeed the first edition, and you see it's very fragile here, the first edition of the program for the dedication of the Gettysburg battlefield in 1863. The Battle of Gettysburg, of course, took place July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd in 1863, the biggest and most important battle of the Civil War. It was called the High Tide of the Confederacy. It's not only the farthest north they came, but after that it was pretty much downhill militarily for the Confederacy. So when they dedicated the cemetery, they invited a very famous American orator by the name of Edward Everett to come and give a speech. Everett did so. He spoke for over 2 hours. People stood in the field for over 2 hours while Everett talked about the history of war, what the Greeks did, what the Romans did, how all of this informed the noble deeds of the soldiers at Gettysburg. After that, they said, we've asked the president to say a few words. And in this booklet, you have to go all the way to page 40, all the way through Everett's speech. And on page 40 are the 10 sentences Lincoln rose to give as the Gettysburg Address. Ironically, Lincoln said, of course, in the Gettysburg Address, the world will little note nor long remember what we say here. Well, the world has noted and remembered what Lincoln said here. Most people agree that one of the best speeches given in the English language. And yet Lincoln's name doesn't even appear on the program. No one remembers Edward Everett, and he knew it at the time. When Lincoln gave his speech and came to sit down, Everett congratulated him and knew that it was a far better speech than he had given in 2 hours. So today we see this program commemorating that. The people at the time said perhaps people were just exhausted after Everett's speech, or they didn't hear Lincoln very well, but he got very little applause on his speech. And he said to his staff, I don't think I did a very good job. Perhaps I didn't rise to the occasion. But Everett knew he had, and certainly history has judged that he has. Next we have Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville. Tocqueville was a French nobleman who was very much in favor of democracy. He managed to survive the reign of terror after the French Revolution because, of course, many of the nobility lost their heads, literally, because they were associated with the ruling class. But Tocqueville, while he came from a wealthy family and had a title, was very much in favor of democracy. He's a pioneering sociologist, so he's a personal hero of mine. He came to the United States to find out how does democracy really work in this new, young country. And it's ironic that one of the best descriptions of democratic practices in the United States was actually done by a Frenchman who came to the United States in the 1820s. This particular first edition is notable because it publishes for the first time the results of the 1840 census, and also in every volume has in the front a hand-colored map of the United States, which is, quite an achievement to go in every single copy of the book. Many people have said that Tocqueville, his Democracy in America is one of the intellectual triumphs of the 19th century. Very highly regarded and still stands up today as a history of the social mores, culture, and political practices of the time. Now we start the literary section of the development of the American character. And the first one we have is a first edition of Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays, Self-Reliance. Ralph Waldo Emerson, a very prominent literary figure in 19th century America. He was associated with the notion of the Yankee individualism, Yankee ingenuity. He was from Massachusetts. One of his famous quotes in here in his essays is, "To believe your own thought, that is genius." When he was asked to characterize the theme of his work, the dominant theme, he said, it's about the infinitude of the private man. So Emerson really lays out individualism, which is such an important value in American culture, the celebration of the powerful, independent individual. Also celebrated by Walt Whitman. This is a copy of Leaves of Grass. It comes in 2 volumes. This particular edition was published in 1942. Whitman was a contemporary of Ralph Waldo Emerson. In fact, Walt Whitman served as a nurse during the Civil War. He wrote Leaves of Grass and rewrote it many times through most of the 19th century, actually. There were multiple editions of his work. Some of the most famous poems that are in this book are Song of Myself, I Sing the Body Electric. He was very controversial in his time because he was unashamed of the fact that he was gay. And in the 19th century, especially, that was fairly controversial. Ralph Waldo Emerson, who we just talked about, supported Whitman, actually let him live in one of his houses, and took some heat for that. These particular editions say 1942. because they are special editions that include the photographs of the great American photographer Edward Weston. And so these versions were published in 1942 with Edward Weston's photographs and signed by the author. I think 1,500 of these were printed and signed by the author. So it was a limited edition. And that's one of the reasons the Remnant Trust has this particular edition, because of its being special not only for Walt Whitman, but for the photographs of Edward Weston. Then we have Henry David Thoreau. This is a compilation, a first edition, published in 1866, of his essays that include A Yankee in Canada, about his travels, but also, most famously, his essay on civil disobedience, which many people quote today. Certainly Martin Luther King Jr. quoted it, and many others, as part of the right and necessity of citizens nonviolently resisting their government when they disagree. What did Thoreau disagree with? Slavery. Thoreau was a lifelong abolitionist and in fact was a tax resister. He refused to pay taxes to support slavery, and he was very clear about that. So while he paid some taxes, he said, I will not pay any taxes that in any way support slavery. So he was not only a writer of repute, but someone who stood up for his convictions, and that's also part of the theme of the American character. The Remnant Trust at IPFW will not go on forever, but the ideas contained in these works most certainly will. I'm Pat Ashton. Thanks for joining me on this tour of the Remnant Trust at IPFW.